Picture this. A beautiful June wedding. 200 guests. A ceremony that took a year to plan. The bride vanishes during cocktail hour. When the groom finally finds her, she's in a hotel room 3 floors above the reception, with the one man she swore was part of her past. Her ex-husband. The man she said meant nothing anymore. The betrayal was crushing. But what the groom did next, in front of everyone they knew and loved, changed everything. This is the true story of a wedding day that became a public reckoning. Before we get into what happened that day, let me tell you where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Mitchell was 29 years old when she met David Thompson at a charity fundraiser in Portland, Oregon. She was working as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup. David was an architect with his own small firm, the kind of guy who showed up to every event with a genuine smile and asked questions that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. Their friends said they were perfect together. Sarah had been through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier, and David seemed like exactly what she needed. Someone stable, someone kind, someone who wouldn't hurt her the way her ex-husband Marcus had. Sarah's first marriage had ended badly. Marcus was charming when they met in college, but the relationship had been turbulent. He was the kind of man who could make you feel like you were floating one day and completely worthless the next. They fought constantly, broke up and got back together more times than Sarah could count, and when they finally divorced after 4 years of marriage, everyone in her life breathed a sigh of relief. Sarah swore she was done with that chapter. She blocked Marcus on social media, deleted his number, and told herself she was moving forward. Then she met David, and it felt like a fresh start. He was everything Marcus wasn't. Patient. Thoughtful. Calm. They dated for 2 years before David proposed on a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, and when Sarah said yes, she believed she was finally getting her happy ending. The wedding planning process was long but exciting. Sarah's mother helped her pick out a dress, a simple but elegant ivory gown with lace sleeves that made her feel beautiful without being over the top. David's parents offered to help pay for the venue, a restored barn on the outskirts of Portland with string lights and wildflowers and a view of the mountains. They sent out invitations to 200 people, family and friends who had supported them through everything. Sarah spent months planning every detail. The flowers, the menu, the playlist for the reception. She wanted everything to be perfect because this wedding felt like proof that she had moved past her mistakes, that she was capable of building something real and lasting with someone who truly loved her. But there were moments in the months leading up to the wedding when Sarah's friends noticed something was off. Little things, at first. Sarah would get distracted during dress fittings, staring at her phone with a look on her face that her maid of honor couldn't quite read. She seemed anxious in a way that went beyond normal wedding stress. When her best friend Emma asked if everything was okay, Sarah would brush it off and say she was just nervous about the big day. But Emma didn't believe her. One night, about 6 weeks before the wedding, Emma and Sarah were having dinner at a wine bar downtown. Sarah had already had 2 glasses of wine when her phone buzzed on the table. She grabbed it quickly, too quickly, and when Emma glanced over, she saw a name flash across the screen. Marcus. Sarah's face went pale, and she shoved the phone into her purse without saying anything. Emma didn't want to pry, but she couldn't ignore what she'd seen. After Sarah excused herself to go to the bathroom, Emma gently asked her about it. Sarah's response was vague and defensive. She said Marcus had reached out a few weeks earlier to apologize for how things had ended between them, and they'd been texting occasionally, just as friends. Nothing serious. Nothing that mattered. Emma felt uneasy, but she didn't push it. She told herself that Sarah was an adult who could make her own decisions, and besides, Sarah was marrying David in 6 weeks. Whatever was happening with Marcus would probably fizzle out once the wedding was over. But it didn't fizzle out. In fact, it got worse. Sarah started texting Marcus more frequently, late at night when David was asleep or during her lunch breaks at work. The conversation started innocently enough, old memories and inside jokes from their college days, but they quickly became more personal. Marcus told her he missed her. He said he'd made mistakes and that he never should have let her go. Sarah knew she should have stopped responding. She knew that continuing these conversations was a betrayal of David's trust, even if nothing physical had happened yet. But there was something about Marcus that still had a hold on her. He knew how to make her feel wanted in a way that was intoxicating and dangerous, and even though she was planning a wedding to another man, she couldn't seem to let him go. David didn't know about any of this. He was busy with work, finalizing plans for their honeymoon in Italy, and making sure his family was taken care of before the big day. He trusted Sarah completely, and he had no reason not to. When friends asked him if he was nervous about getting married, he would smile and say he'd never been more sure of anything in his life. He believed that he and Sarah were building something strong, something that would last. He had no idea that the foundation was already cracking. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The morning of the wedding was perfect. The weather was clear and warm, exactly what Sarah had hoped for. She woke up early in the bridal suite at the venue, surrounded by her bridesmaids, her mother, and her younger sister. They drank champagne and laughed while the hairstylist pinned Sarah's hair into soft waves. Her makeup artist gave her a natural, glowing look that made her eyes sparkle. When Sarah finally put on her dress, her mother started crying. She looked beautiful, and for a moment, everything felt right. Sarah tried to push away the guilt that had been gnawing at her for weeks. She told herself that today was about her and David, about their future together, and that whatever had been happening with Marcus was over. She hadn't responded to his last text, the one he'd sent the night before asking if he could see her one more time before she got married. She'd deleted it without answering. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon. Guests started arriving around 3, filling the rows of white wooden chairs that had been set up outside the barn. David stood at the altar with his groomsmen, looking sharp in a navy suit. He was nervous, but it was the good kind of nervous, the kind that comes from knowing you're about to commit your life to someone you love. When the music started and the bridesmaids began walking down the aisle, David felt his heart skip. And then Sarah appeared. She looked stunning, walking slowly down the aisle on her father's arm, her bouquet of white roses and greenery trembling slightly in her hands. David felt tears prick his eyes. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. But Sarah's mind was somewhere else. As she walked toward David, she felt her phone buzz in the small clutch her maid of honor was carrying. She knew who it was. Marcus. The ceremony went smoothly, at least on the surface. Sarah and David exchanged vows, their voices steady even though Sarah's hands were shaking. They said their I dos, exchanged rings, and kissed as husband and wife while the guests erupted in applause. For a moment, Sarah felt a wave of relief. She'd done it. She was married to David, and whatever confusion she'd been feeling about Marcus was behind her now. Or so she thought. After the ceremony, the guests moved inside the barn for cocktail hour while Sarah and David took photos with the wedding party. It should have been one of the happiest hours of Sarah's life, but she couldn't stop thinking about that text. Finally, during a break between photo sessions, she grabbed her clutch and checked her phone. Marcus had sent her a message. He was at a hotel 2 miles from the venue. He said he needed to see her, that he couldn't let her get married without telling her how he really felt. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She should have ignored the message. She should have blocked his number right then and there and focused on the man she just married. But she didn't. Instead, she told David she needed a few minutes to freshen up, and she slipped away from the photo session. She told her maid of honor to cover for her, saying she was feeling lightheaded and needed to sit down for a moment. Then she got into her car, still in her wedding dress, and drove to the hotel where Marcus was waiting. The drive took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Sarah's mind was racing. What was she doing? Why was she risking everything for a man who had hurt her so badly? But she couldn't stop herself. When she pulled into the hotel parking lot and saw Marcus standing outside the entrance, something inside her snapped. She parked the car, got out, and walked toward him. He smiled at her, that same devastating smile that had always made her weak, and without saying a word, he took her hand and led her inside. What happened next is something Sarah would regret for the rest of her life. She and Marcus went up to his hotel room, and within minutes, they were kissing. It was frantic and desperate, fueled by years of unresolved feelings and the forbidden nature of what they were doing. Sarah knew it was wrong. She knew that downstairs at the barn, her new husband was probably wondering where she was, that her guests were waiting for her to make her grand entrance at the reception. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. She let Marcus pull her into bed, and they slept together while her wedding reception was starting without her. Afterward, as Sarah lay there staring at the ceiling, the full weight of what she'd done hit her like a freight train. She had just cheated on her husband on their wedding day. She felt sick. She grabbed her dress, which was now wrinkled and smudged, and rushed to get dressed. Marcus tried to talk to her, to convince her to stay, but she couldn't even look at him. She ran out of the room, down the elevator, and back to her car. Meanwhile, back at the barn, David was starting to panic. Sarah had been gone for over an hour, and no one seemed to know where she was. Her maid of honor said she'd needed to freshen up, but when David checked the bridal suite, it was empty. He called Sarah's phone repeatedly, but she didn't answer. The guests were getting restless, asking when dinner would be served and when the first dance would happen. David's best man, a childhood friend named Ryan, tried to calm him down, suggesting that maybe Sarah had gotten overwhelmed and needed some air. But David had a sick feeling in his stomach that something was very wrong. He asked Ryan to help him search the venue, checking every room, every corner, every possible place Sarah might be hiding. They found nothing. Finally, David decided to check the parking lot. That's when he noticed that Sarah's car was gone. David felt his chest tighten. Why would Sarah leave the venue in the middle of their wedding reception? Where could she possibly have gone? He tried calling her again, and this time, she answered. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. She told him she'd be back in a few minutes, that she just needed to step away for a moment. David asked her where she was, but she hung up before he could finish the question. 10 minutes later, Sarah pulled back into the parking lot. David was standing outside, waiting for her. When she got out of the car, he could see immediately that something was wrong. Her makeup was smudged, her hair was disheveled, and there were wrinkles in her dress that hadn't been there before. David stared at her, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Sarah couldn't meet his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then David asked the question that would change everything. "Where were you?" Sarah tried to lie. She said she'd felt sick and had driven to a nearby pharmacy to get some medicine. But David wasn't stupid. He could see the guilt written all over her face. He stepped closer to her, his voice low and controlled, and asked her again. "Where were you, Sarah?" This time, she broke. She started crying, her whole body shaking, and through her sobs, she told him the truth. She'd gone to see Marcus. David felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Marcus? Her ex-husband? The man she'd sworn meant nothing to her anymore? Sarah tried to explain, to justify what she'd done, but David wasn't listening. He felt a rage building inside him that he'd never experienced before. He asked her if she'd slept with Marcus, and when she hesitated, he knew the answer. She had. She had slept with her ex-husband on their wedding day, while their friends and family were inside waiting to celebrate their marriage. David didn't yell. He didn't scream or throw things or make a scene in the parking lot. Instead, he turned around and walked back into the barn, leaving Sarah standing alone by her car. She called after him, begging him to wait, to let her explain, but he kept walking. Inside, the guests were still mingling, oblivious to the disaster that was unfolding. David found Ryan and pulled him aside. He told him what Sarah had just confessed, and Ryan's face went pale. He asked David what he was going to do, and David said he didn't know. He needed time to think. But he didn't have time. The guests were waiting, and someone needed to tell them what was going on. David made a decision. He walked up to the microphone that had been set up for the toasts, and he tapped it to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent. 200 people turned to look at him, expecting him to make a heartfelt speech about his new wife. Instead, David told them the truth. He didn't go into graphic detail. He didn't humiliate Sarah in front of everyone, even though he had every right to. He simply said that the wedding reception was over, that he and Sarah would not be continuing with the celebration, and that he was sorry for any inconvenience this caused. The room erupted in shocked whispers and confused murmurs. People started pulling out their phones, texting each other, trying to figure out what had just happened. Sarah's mother ran outside to find her daughter, and when she did, she found Sarah sitting in her car, sobbing uncontrollably. David's parents were furious, demanding answers, but David refused to give them any. He told everyone to go home, and within an hour, the venue was empty. The band packed up their instruments. The caterers threw away the uneaten food. The photographer left without taking a single reception photo. It was over. If this hooked you already, don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop a comment because what happens next will absolutely shatter your expectations. In the days that followed, the story of what happened at Sarah and David's wedding spread like wildfire. Friends who had been at the reception told other friends, who told their co-workers, who posted about it on social media. Within a week, the story had gone viral in their local community. People who didn't even know Sarah or David were weighing in, sharing their opinions on who was to blame and what should happen next. Sarah became the subject of intense public scrutiny and judgment. Strangers on the internet called her terrible names, accused her of being selfish and cruel, and said she deserved whatever consequences came her way. Some people were more sympathetic, pointing out that Sarah was clearly struggling with unresolved feelings from her past and that she needed help, not condemnation. But the overwhelming consensus was that what she'd done was unforgivable. David moved out of the apartment he and Sarah had been sharing and went to stay with his parents. He didn't speak to Sarah for 2 weeks, ignoring her calls and texts and refusing to see her when she showed up at his parents' house begging for a chance to explain. His friends rallied around him, telling him he deserved better and that he should file for an annulment immediately. David knew they were right, but part of him still loved Sarah, and that made everything so much harder. He kept replaying their relationship in his mind, trying to figure out if there had been signs he'd missed, clues that Sarah wasn't as committed as she'd claimed to be. He blamed himself for not seeing it coming, even though he knew logically that he wasn't the one who had betrayed their vows. Sarah, meanwhile, was a mess. She'd lost her husband, her reputation, and the respect of almost everyone she knew, all in a single day. She couldn't go to work without people staring at her and whispering behind her back. Her mother barely spoke to her, heartbroken and ashamed of what her daughter had done. Sarah tried to reach out to Marcus, hoping for some kind of support or understanding, but he'd disappeared. He'd checked out of the hotel the morning after the wedding and hadn't responded to any of her messages since. It became clear that Marcus had never cared about her the way she'd thought he did. He just wanted to see if he could still have power over her, and once he'd proven that he could, he'd moved on. Sarah felt like the biggest fool in the world. She'd thrown away her marriage, her future, and her dignity for a man who didn't even want her. 3 weeks after the wedding, David finally agreed to meet with Sarah. They sat in a coffee shop on the opposite side of town from where they used to live, and for the first time since that horrible day, they talked. Sarah apologized over and over, crying and begging David to forgive her. She said she didn't know why she'd done it, that she'd been confused and scared and had made the worst mistake of her life. David listened, but he didn't say much. When Sarah was finished, he told her that he couldn't forgive her. Not now, maybe not ever. He said he'd filed for an annulment and that he wanted her to sign the papers so they could both move on. Sarah signed the papers that same day. The marriage that had lasted less than 2 hours was officially over. David tried to rebuild his life, but it wasn't easy. He threw himself into his work, took on new projects, and started seeing a therapist to help him process what had happened. His friends and family supported him as best they could, but there was no quick fix for the kind of pain he was feeling. He'd trusted Sarah completely, and she'd shattered that trust in the worst possible way. It took months before he could even think about dating again, and when he finally did, he found himself constantly second-guessing his judgment. What if he missed the signs again? What if the next person he fell for turned out to be just as unreliable as Sarah? These were questions that haunted him long after the annulment was finalized. Sarah's life didn't get easier either. She eventually quit her job and moved to a different city, hoping for a fresh start where people didn't know her story. She started therapy as well, trying to understand why she'd sabotaged her own happiness and how she could avoid making the same mistakes in the future. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. About 6 months after the annulment, Sarah received a letter in the mail. It was from David. She almost didn't open it, afraid of what it might say, but her curiosity got the better of her. Inside was a single handwritten page. David wrote that he'd been doing a lot of thinking about what happened, and while he still believed that Sarah had made a terrible choice, he'd come to realize that he wasn't entirely blameless either. He said that in the months leading up to the wedding, he'd been so focused on the logistics of planning their future together that he'd stopped paying attention to whether Sarah was actually happy. He'd ignored the signs that she was struggling, brushed off her occasional moments of doubt as cold feet, and assumed that everything would be fine once they were married. David wrote that he wasn't excusing what Sarah had done, but he wanted her to know that he understood now that their relationship had problems neither of them had addressed. Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't expected David to ever speak to her again, let alone reach out with something so thoughtful and introspective. She wrote back immediately, thanking him for his honesty and telling him how deeply sorry she still was for the pain she'd caused. They started exchanging letters, slowly and cautiously at first, and then more frequently. They talked about their relationship, what had gone wrong, and what they both wished they'd done differently. It wasn't romantic, at least not at first. It was two people trying to make sense of a tragedy and find some kind of closure. But over time, something shifted. They realized that despite everything that had happened, they still cared about each other. They started talking on the phone, and eventually, they agreed to meet in person. It was awkward and emotional, but it was also healing in a way neither of them had anticipated. David told Sarah that he wasn't sure if they could ever be together again, but he wanted to try being friends. Sarah agreed, grateful for even the smallest chance to have him back in her life. They spent the next year rebuilding their relationship from the ground up, this time with complete honesty and transparency. Sarah told David about her lingering feelings for Marcus, how she'd been using the thrill of that forbidden connection to avoid dealing with her own insecurities and fears about marriage. David admitted that he'd been so eager to prove that he was different from Marcus that he'd overlooked the fact that Sarah needed more emotional support than he'd been giving her. They both acknowledged their mistakes, and slowly, they started to trust each other again. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but they were committed to doing the work this time. 18 months after their disastrous wedding, David proposed to Sarah again. This time, there was no big elaborate plan, no grand romantic gesture. He simply asked her if she wanted to try again, to build a life together the right way this time. Sarah said yes, but she told David that she didn't want a big wedding. She didn't want the pressure, the expectations, or the public spectacle. David agreed. They got married in a small courthouse ceremony with just their immediate families present. There were no bridesmaids, no groomsmen, no reception. Just two people making a promise to each other, knowing full well how fragile and precious that promise was. And this time, Sarah kept it. They built a life together that was grounded in honesty, communication, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, because no marriage ever is, but it was real. They had a daughter 2 years later, and they often talked about how close they'd come to losing everything. Sarah never spoke to Marcus again, and she made peace with the fact that what happened that day was entirely her responsibility. David forgave her, truly forgave her, and that forgiveness allowed them both to move forward. If you're still here, subscribe, because stories like this only work when people stay. Now, before I continue, let me ask you this. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe and let's prove her wrong. So here's the question that this story raises. Was David right to forgive Sarah? Or did he make a mistake by giving her a second chance after such a profound betrayal? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. Some people believe that infidelity, especially on a wedding day, is an unforgivable act that destroys any possibility of trust. They would argue that David should have walked away and never looked back, that Sarah didn't deserve his forgiveness or his love after what she did. Others believe that people are capable of change, that mistakes, even terrible ones, don't have to define someone forever. They would say that David's willingness to forgive Sarah was a sign of strength, not weakness, and that their story is proof that healing is possible even after the worst kind of betrayal. There's no right or wrong answer here. Every relationship is different, and what works for one couple might not work for another. But what this story does illustrate is the complexity of human emotions and the devastating consequences of unresolved emotional baggage. Sarah's affair with Marcus wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about her own fear of commitment, her inability to fully let go of her past, and her failure to communicate those feelings to David before it was too late. Marcus represented a part of Sarah's life that felt familiar and safe, even though it was actually toxic and destructive. When she felt overwhelmed by the permanence of marrying David, she ran back to what she knew, even though it was the worst possible decision she could have made. David's decision to eventually forgive Sarah wasn't made lightly. He spent months in therapy, working through his anger, his hurt, and his sense of betrayal. He had to ask himself some very difficult questions. Could he ever trust Sarah again? Could he move past what she'd done? And perhaps most importantly, did he still love her enough to try? The answer to that last question was yes, but it came with conditions. David made it clear that if they were going to rebuild their relationship, it had to be different this time. No more secrets, no more avoiding difficult conversations, and no more pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Sarah had to do the same work, confronting her own issues and figuring out why she'd sabotaged herself in the first place. It took time, patience, and a lot of uncomfortable honesty, but eventually, they got there. Their story isn't a fairy tale. It's messy and painful and full of mistakes. But it's also a testament to the fact that sometimes, love is about more than just the good times. It's about choosing to show up for someone even when it's hard, even when you've been hurt, even when the easiest thing would be to walk away. Not every relationship deserves a second chance. Some betrayals are too deep, some wounds too painful to heal. But in Sarah and David's case, they both decided that their relationship was worth fighting for, and they did the hard work necessary to make it last. So let me ask you this. If you were in David's position, would you have forgiven Sarah? Could you have moved past the betrayal and rebuilt a life with someone who hurt you so profoundly on what was supposed to be the happiest day of your life? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? And if you were Sarah, would you have had the courage to do the work necessary to earn back David's trust, knowing that you might never succeed? These are questions worth thinking about, because relationships, at their core, are about choices. The choice to be honest, the choice to be vulnerable, the choice to forgive, and the choice to stay even when leaving would be easier. Sarah and David made those choices, and while their story started with one of the worst wedding day disasters imaginable, it ended with something that many people never find. A love that survived its own destruction and came back stronger. What do you think really happened that day, and did David go too far by forgiving her, or did he not do enough? Tell me your honest opinion in the comments. I read every single one. How would you feel if this happened to you? Would you be able to forgive someone who betrayed you on your wedding day, or would that be a line you could never uncross? And what about Sarah? Do you think she genuinely changed, or was David setting himself up for another heartbreak down the road? These are the questions that make this story so compelling, because there are no easy answers. Every person who hears this story will have a different reaction based on their own experiences, their own values, and their own understanding of what love and forgiveness really mean. If this story shocked you, wait until you hear what happened in our next case. It makes this wedding look calm. Subscribe for more real-life twists and unforgettable stories. Because the truth is, reality is often stranger and more complicated than anything we could make up.